The police officer spits in the face of the old man selling cakes. The next day.
Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Mr. Anthony's small pastry stall sat humbly in a corner. The aroma of freshly baked pastries wafted through the air, drawing the gaze of passers-by. Anthony, an elderly man with a gentle demeanor, carefully arranged the pastries in their places. The deep wrinkles on his face were not just marks of time but also witnesses to the hardships he had endured. Suddenly, the peaceful morning atmosphere was broken by heavy footsteps. Samuel, a middle-aged police officer with a stern face and rigid posture, appeared from afar. His uniform was neatly pressed, but his eyes radiated irritation. Those passing by lowered their heads, avoiding his gaze, as if not wanting to invite trouble. "Anthony!" Samuel called out loudly, his voice dry and commanding. "Do you think this is a place to set up shop? This is public space, not somewhere for you to take over." Anthony looked up, his gaze calm but slightly worried. "Sir, I only sell pastries here for a few hours in the morning. I'm not obstructing anyone. If you find it inappropriate, I'm willing to move." Samuel cut him off, his face full of disdain. "It's not about whether it's appropriate or not. You're occupying public space, and that's against the law. If you want to move, do it now." Martha stepped forward, trying to intervene. "Officer, Mr. Anthony is just an elderly man selling pastries to make a living. He's not bothering anyone." "Young lady, stay out of my business," Samuel snapped at Martha, his cold eyes sharp. "No one is above the law, regardless of the reason." A few passers-by began to gather, murmuring among themselves, though no one dared to speak up. "Samuel is so rigid," a woman named Caroline whispered to the person next to her. "Anthony is so kind, he doesn't deserve this." Anthony took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Sir, I apologize if I've caused any inconvenience. But please, give me a little time to pack up." Samuel let out a mocking laugh, stepping closer to Anthony's stall. "Pack up." He leaned down and spat forcefully onto the stall. The action left the crowd in stunned silence. The murmuring grew louder. Martha stood frozen, unable to find words for what she had just witnessed. A man named Lewis, a regular customer of Anthony's, stepped forward. "Officer, this behavior is unacceptable." Samuel turned, his icy gaze fixed on Lewis. "What are you trying to say?" "This is my job. If you don't like it, you can leave." Lewis clenched his fists but dared not go further. Anthony remained standing, his eyes filled with sadness but devoid of resentment. He bent down and slowly wiped the stall clean with a cloth, his movements deliberate yet patient. "I understand, sir," he said softly. "I'll leave right away." The crowd seemed to hold their breath. A few people stepped forward to buy pastries from Anthony before the stall had to be packed up. Martha looked at him with regret in her eyes. "Mr. Anthony, I'm sorry I couldn't help you." "It's all right, Martha," Anthony replied, his voice trembling but steady. "I'm used to it. It's fine." Samuel turned and walked away, his face showing satisfaction. "Don't make me come back," he called out, his words a warning. As Samuel left, the crowd gradually dispersed. Martha stayed behind, helping Anthony gather the remaining pastries. Caroline approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Anthony, you don't deserve to be treated like this. We won't let you go through this alone." Anthony nodded gently, but his eyes remained sorrowful. He looked at his pastries as if seeing fragments of a life he had tried to piece together, only to have them trampled upon. The next morning, Anthony returned to his familiar corner of the square, as if the events of the previous day were just a passing wind. Freshly baked pastries were neatly arranged on the stall, their sweet aroma drawing the attention of passers-by. But this time, his eyes no longer sparkled as they once did. Instead, they held a quiet solemnity, like someone trying to conceal a deep sadness. Martha arrived earlier than usual, carrying a small basket. "Mr. Anthony, I brought some clean cloths for you today. I thought you might need them after yesterday." "Thank you, Martha," Anthony said with a gentle smile, accepting the basket. "You're so kind. I don't know what I'd do without people like you." Martha was silent for a moment, her eyes filled with concern. "Mr. Anthony, I know you're a patient man, but Samuel went too far. I really can't understand why he acted that way." Anthony simply shook his head. "Samuel has his reasons. Maybe I'm just a thorn in his side right now. But don't worry, I'm used to it." As they spoke, a middle-aged man named Peter approached. Peter owned a small cafe in the area and often bought pastries from Anthony to serve alongside his coffee. He placed a hand on the stall, his expression serious. "Anthony, I heard about yesterday," Peter said, his voice low but firm. "Samuel's actions were unacceptable. If you need any help, just let me know." Anthony bowed his head in gratitude. "Thank you, Peter. But I don't want to cause any more trouble. I just want to sell my pastries and live peacefully." Peter sighed. "Peace is what you deserve, but with Samuel, I'm afraid that won't be easy." As if to prove Peter's point, the sound of heavy boots echoed from afar. Samuel appeared, his uniform still immaculate, but his face now filled with resentment. Passers-by began to step aside, clearing the way for him as the air seemed to freeze. "Selling again this morning, Anthony?" Samuel called out loudly, his tone mocking. "What did I say yesterday? You're not allowed to sell here anymore." Peter stepped in front of the stall, his gaze unwavering. "Officer, Mr. Anthony has done nothing wrong. He's just selling a few pastries to make a living. This doesn't harm anyone." "Peter, you should mind your own business," Samuel retorted, his eyes cold. "This is between me and Anthony." "But Anthony hasn't done anything wrong," Peter argued. "He's just trying to survive. Do you have no heart, Samuel?" Samuel took a step forward, his face darkening. "Peter, you're interfering with a law enforcement officer's duties. Be careful, or I'll deal with you too." The bystanders stopped, murmuring among themselves. Some seemed to want to speak up but remained silent, intimidated by Samuel's authority. Martha stood still beside Anthony, her hands clenched tightly. Anthony gently placed a hand on Peter's shoulder, shaking his head. "Peter, let me talk to Samuel. I don't want anyone else to get in trouble because of me." Peter looked at Anthony, his eyes full of helplessness, but he eventually stepped back. Anthony turned to Samuel, his voice soft but firm. "Officer, I'm sorry if my presence causes discomfort. But I have nowhere else to go. If you think I shouldn't be here, I'll leave." Samuel smirked, his eyes cold. "That's what I wanted to hear." He stepped forward, glancing around the stall. "But before you leave, I want to make sure you don't dare come back here again." Then, without warning, he swung his hand and knocked a pastry onto the ground. Martha let out a cry of shock, and the surrounding crowd held their breath. Peter clenched his fists tightly, but Anthony simply stood there, his eyes fixed on the crushed pastry on the cobblestones. "Enough, Samuel." A voice rang out. It was Caroline, the woman who had witnessed the incident the day before. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. "He's just an old man selling pastries. Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" Samuel turned, raising an eyebrow. "Do you want to be arrested for obstructing a law enforcement officer, Caroline?" Caroline didn't back down. "If you're going to arrest me for defending an innocent man, go ahead. But let me tell you something, Samuel, nobody respects a person like you." The murmuring among the crowd grew louder. Some people nearby nodded in agreement, but no one dared to act. Martha stepped forward, taking Anthony's hand. "Mr. Anthony, please, don't stay here anymore. I don't want you to get hurt any further." Anthony looked around, his eyes filled with sadness but also determination. Martha, this is my life. If I give up, I'll have nothing left. Samuel turned to Caroline, smirking. I'll give everyone one last chance to disperse before things escalate. Anthony, pack up right now, or I'll confiscate your entire stall. Anthony bowed his head, his voice heavy with exhaustion. All right, sir. I'll pack up. That afternoon, Anthony sat at a small wooden table in his old kitchen. Sunlight streaming through the window created warm streaks of light, but it could not dispel the sorrow in his heart. In front of him were the unsold pastries, still fragrant with butter and vanilla. However, the image of Samuel knocking over the pastries that morning lingered in his mind, leaving a sharp pain in his chest. The creak of the wooden door broke the silence. Martha entered, carrying a small fabric bag. Mr. Anthony, I brought some flour and sugar for you. I know you didn't sell much today. Anthony looked up, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Martha. But I can't keep taking your help. You have your family to care for. Mr. Anthony, please don't say that, Martha said softly as she placed the bag of flour on the table. My mother always taught me that helping others gives meaning to life. You've given me the best pastries. Now it's my turn to do something for you. Anthony smiled gently, a smile tinged with deep sadness. He didn't want anyone to worry about him, but he couldn't bring himself to refuse Martha's kindness. Carefully, he placed the bag of flour on the shelf, then returned to the table to adjust the remaining pastries. Outside, Peter arrived and knocked on the door. Anthony, I need to talk to you, he said loudly, his voice trying to mask the frustration in his heart. Anthony invited Peter in. Peter sat down across from him, his face serious. Anthony, I can't just sit back and watch you be treated like this, Peter said. Samuel's behavior is completely unacceptable. We need to do something. Anthony shook his head. Peter, I appreciate your concern, but I don't want to cause more trouble. Samuel is a police officer, and he has authority. I'm just an old man selling pastries, I don't want to make this into a bigger issue. Peter slammed his hand on the table, his eyes burning with anger. Anthony, you don't deserve to be treated like this. If we stay silent, Samuel will only abuse his power more. He won't stop. Anthony remained silent. He knew Peter was right, but he also understood the harshness of life. He didn't believe he could change anything. He just wanted to live peacefully, no matter how difficult it might be. That evening, Martha returned, this time with Caroline. Both women looked tense. As soon as Caroline entered, she spoke up. Anthony, I've spoken to some neighbors. They're outraged at Samuel too. If you agree, we can write a petition to the authorities demanding action against him. Anthony raised his hand, signaling Caroline to stop. Caroline, thank you, but I don't want anyone else to get involved. Samuel isn't someone easy to deal with. If we escalate this, he won't spare anyone. Caroline clenched her fists, clearly dissatisfied with his response. Anthony, you can't keep enduring this. Sometimes, we have to stand up for what's right. Martha looked at Anthony, her eyes filled with empathy. Mr. Anthony, I know you don't want to trouble anyone, but if we don't act, things will only get worse. You don't deserve to be treated this way. Anthony sighed, his gaze distant. He understood their good intentions, but he also knew the harsh realities of life. My dear, I truly appreciate it. But let me think about it. I don't want anyone to suffer because of me. That night, Anthony sat alone by the window, watching the streetlights cast shadows into the darkness. His small room was eerily silent, save for the ticking of an old clock. He thought about Peter, Martha, and Caroline's words. They all wanted to help him, but Anthony knew that any resistance came with a price. And he feared that price might be too high. Suddenly, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Anthony stood up, opened the door, and saw Louis, a regular customer, standing there. Louis held a paper bag containing a few small dishes. "Anthony, I brought you some food. I thought you might not have eaten today." "Thank you, Louis," Anthony said, his eyes reflecting gratitude. "But you don't need to worry about me like this." Louis smiled and placed the bag on the table. "Anthony, I know you're a good man. Your pastries aren't just delicious, they bring joy to everyone. I don't want to see you face injustice." Anthony remained silent, his heart heavy. He didn't know how to repay everyone's kindness. All he knew was that they were trying to help him, and that thought made him feel both warm and burdened. That night, Anthony tossed and turned, unable to sleep. He thought about Samuel, the officer's cruel words and actions. He also thought about Peter, Martha, Caroline, and Louis, the people who had stood by him. Anthony didn't know if he had the strength to face it all, but he knew he couldn't keep hiding. The next morning, Anthony stepped into the square with a small basket containing freshly baked pastries. Though his heart was still heavy from the recent events, he knew he couldn't give up. His little stall wasn't just his livelihood, it was his pride, his way of connecting with those around him. As he set the basket down, Martha appeared, carrying a bag of clean cloths. "Mr. Anthony, I'm staying with you today. I want to make sure Samuel doesn't dare do anything outrageous again." Anthony looked at Martha, his eyes a mix of gratitude and concern. "Martha, I don't want you to get into trouble. You're young, you shouldn't get involved in this." "Mr. Anthony," Martha replied firmly, "I can't just stand by and watch you be treated unfairly. I believe there are many others who feel the same way." Sure enough, before long, Peter and Caroline arrived. They didn't say much, but they quietly stood by the stall, forming an unspoken shield around Anthony. The crowd of passers-by began to take notice. Some stopped to buy pastries, while others observed from a distance, curious about the growing support for Anthony. "You all don't need to do this," Anthony said softly, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I don't want anyone caught up in my troubles." Peter placed a hand on Anthony's shoulder and shook his head. "Anthony, this isn't just about you. It's about justice. Samuel can't keep abusing his power." At that moment, familiar footsteps echoed in the distance. Samuel appeared from afar, his face maintaining its usual arrogance. He spotted the crowd and frowned slightly but quickly regained his composure. "It's you again, Anthony," Samuel said loudly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I thought I made myself clear. You're not allowed to sell here." Peter stepped forward, standing in front of the pastry stand. "Samuel, Mr. Anthony hasn't done anything wrong. He's just selling a few pastries to make a living. Why are you deliberately making things hard for him?" Samuel let out a cold chuckle, his gaze sharp. "Peter, I suggest you mind your own business. If you keep interfering, I'll deal with you too." Caroline couldn't stay silent. "Samuel, don't you feel ashamed of bullying a kind old man? You're tarnishing the image of law enforcement." "Caroline," Samuel replied, lowering his voice but making it menacing, "I won't hesitate to arrest you for obstructing official duties." The atmosphere grew tense. The crowd around them started murmuring louder. Some looked indignant, but most kept their distance, wary of Samuel's authority. Martha glanced at Mr. Anthony, her eyes full of worry. "Mr. Anthony, we should pack up and leave," Martha whispered. "I'm afraid Samuel might do something worse." Anthony shook his head gently. "Martha, I can't leave. This is my livelihood. If I give up, I'll lose everything." Samuel stepped closer, standing face to face with Anthony. "This is my final warning, Anthony. Pack up your pastry stand right now, or I'll confiscate everything." Anthony looked up, and his eyes no longer held the fear they once did. "Officer, I don't want to cause trouble. But I can't back down. If you must, you can take my stand. But I won't stop." Anthony's words left the crowd stunned. A few people began clapping, as if to encourage his resilience. Samuel glanced around, his face reddening with anger. "Fine," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "If this is how you want it, don't blame me." He raised his hand, about to overturn the pastry stand, when a voice rang out, halting him. "Stop right there, Samuel." It was Louis, a regular customer of Anthony's. He stepped out from the crowd, his eyes blazing with anger. "You're blatantly abusing your power. Anthony hasn't done anything wrong, and you have no right to treat him like this." Samuel turned, frowning. "Louis, I suggest you stay quiet. If you don't, you'll find yourself in trouble too." Louis stood firm. "I'm not afraid of you, Samuel. What are you going to do? Arrest me for standing up for an innocent man?" The crowd began to cheer for Louis, their voices growing louder. Some moved forward to stand with him, forming a protective barrier around Anthony's stand. Samuel looked around, clearly caught off guard by the resistance. He clenched his jaw and finally turned away, leaving without another word. Anthony let out a sigh of relief, though his expression remained heavy. "Thank you, everyone," he said, his voice trembling. "But I don't want anyone to get into trouble because of me." Peter patted Anthony's shoulder, offering a small smile. "Anthony, we're here not just for you. We're here for justice." As the crowd dispersed, Peter, Martha, Caroline, and Louis stayed behind to help Anthony clean up and rearrange his stand. Anthony felt the warmth of those around him but also knew this battle was far from over. The next morning, the usually fresh air of the square seemed heavier than usual. Anthony returned with his small pastry stand, maintaining his usual kind and patient demeanor. Yet, this time, there was an unmistakable worry in his eyes. Martha, Peter, and Caroline had promised to come and support him, but that didn't ease the uneasiness in his heart. As Anthony finished setting up his pastries, Martha arrived, carrying a small basket. "Mr. Anthony, I brought some coffee and cloths for you," Martha said, her smile like a small ray of sunshine amid the gloomy sky. "Thank you, Martha," Anthony nodded softly. "You're so kind. I don't know what I'd do without you." Martha looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. "Mr. Anthony, I heard Samuel was furious when he got back to the station yesterday. I'm afraid he'll come back today and cause even more trouble." Anthony let out a soft sigh. "Martha, I don't want to create problems for anyone. But if I give up, I'll have nothing left." Before Anthony could finish his words, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from afar. Samuel appeared, his face more furious than ever. Following behind him was another officer, a young man named Pablo. The tension in the square immediately heightened. Passers-by stopped in their tracks, some quietly moved to the side, while others whispered to each other. "Anthony!" Samuel bellowed, his voice reverberating through the square. "I warned you. Why are you still selling here?" Peter, who had just arrived, immediately stepped forward to block the pastry stand. "Samuel, Mr. Anthony hasn't done anything wrong. He's just selling pastries to make a living. You can't keep bullying him." Samuel's expression was icy as he glared at Peter. "Peter, I've warned you many times. If you keep interfering, I'll take you to the station right now." Pablo, the young officer accompanying Samuel, appeared uneasy. He looked around, his eyes revealing discomfort as the crowd began to gather. "Samuel, maybe we should calm down," Pablo whispered, but Samuel ignored him. Caroline also stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. "Samuel, don't you feel ashamed of yourself for acting like this? Mr. Anthony is just a kind old man. You're disgracing your uniform." Samuel didn't reply and instead moved closer to the pastry stand. He stared at the delicious pastries before suddenly raising his hand and sweeping an entire tray of pastries to the ground. The sound of pastries hitting the pavement and breaking apart stunned everyone around. Martha screamed and rushed forward to pick up the broken pieces, tears streaming down her face. "That's enough, Samuel." Lewis appeared from the crowd, his voice strong and determined. "Your actions are unacceptable. You don't deserve to wear that uniform." Samuel turned, his eyes blazing with rage. "Lewis, do you want to be arrested for obstructing official duties? Don't push me." Lewis didn't back down. "I'm not afraid of you, Samuel. If you want to arrest me, go ahead. But you should know that this entire neighborhood will stand up against you." The crowd began to rally behind Lewis, their voices growing louder. Some moved closer, forming a protective circle around Anthony's stand. Pablo, sensing the growing discontent among the crowd, tugged lightly at Samuel's arm and whispered, "Samuel, I think we should retreat. This is getting out of hand." "Shut up, Pablo," Samuel snapped. "I know what I'm doing." Anthony, who had remained silent until now, finally stepped forward. He stood in front of Samuel, his voice soft yet resolute. "Officer, I don't want to cause trouble for anyone. But if you feel the need to arrest me to resolve this, I'm ready to go with you." Anthony's words left the square in silence. The crowd looked at him with admiration but also sorrow. Peter clenched his fists tightly, Caroline covered her mouth to stifle a sob, and Martha clung to Anthony's arm, her tears flowing uncontrollably. "Mr. Anthony, you can't," Martha whispered. "You can't let them take you." Anthony turned to Martha, his gaze gentle. "Martha, if I don't do this, Samuel won't stop. I don't want anyone else to suffer because of me." Samuel laughed loudly, but it was not a joyful laugh. "So, you've finally come to your senses. Fine, Anthony, follow me." But before Samuel could act, Lewis spoke up again. "If you arrest Anthony, you'll have to arrest me too. I won't let him go alone. And me as well," Peter said loudly, stepping forward to stand beside Anthony. Caroline joined them, and Martha followed. One by one, members of the crowd stepped forward, forming a circle around Anthony. Samuel stood frozen, caught off guard. He had never expected an elderly man like Anthony to garner such strong support. Pablo tugged at his arm again, this time with a firmer tone. "Samuel, don't do this. We're not going to win." Looking at the growing circle of people around Anthony, Samuel clenched his teeth and shook Pablo off. "Fine," he said loudly, his voice seething with anger. "But Anthony, don't think this is over. I'll be back." He turned and walked away, leaving tension lingering in the air. Anthony stood there, his eyes weary but filled with gratitude. "Thank you, everyone," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I don't know what else to say." Peter patted Anthony on the shoulder with a small smile. "You're not alone, Anthony. We'll always be here for you." The next morning, the small square seemed livelier than usual. Passers-by murmured, discussing the recent events. Anthony returned as usual, his thin hands carefully arranging the fragrant pastries on his stall. Though he kept his gentle smile, his eyes betrayed his fatigue and worry. Martha arrived early, carrying a small basket filled with cloths and some bread she had just baked. "Mr. Anthony, I came early to help you. There'll be more people coming to buy pastries today than usual." Anthony looked at Martha and nodded slightly. "Thank you, Martha. But you don't have to keep worrying about me like this. You have your own life to live." Martha shook her head, her eyes resolute. "Mr. Anthony, everyone wants to help you. Don't try to carry everything on your own." Not long after, Peter and Caroline arrived. Peter brought a small table to help Anthony better organize the stall, while Caroline prepared clean tablecloths. A crowd began to gather, some to buy pastries, others to watch and discuss. "People aren't just here for your pastries, Anthony," Peter said, his deep voice filled with warmth. "They're here because they respect you. They want to protect you." Caroline added, Anthony, your patience and kindness have inspired everyone. This isn't just about you anymore. Anthony sighed, his eyes scanning the passers-by. I know everyone means well, but Samuel won't stop. He'll keep finding ways to cause trouble. Peter nodded. That's true. But if he comes back, we won't let you face him alone. As everyone busied themselves helping Anthony, a familiar figure appeared in the distance. Samuel entered the square, this time not alone. Walking with him were two other police officers. One was Pablo, and the other a young officer with a stern face. The atmosphere in the square immediately grew tense as all eyes turned toward them. Samuel marched straight to the stall, his cold gaze enough to make everyone uneasy. Anthony, he said loudly, his voice commanding, I've warned you many times. Today, I don't have time to argue. Pack up this stall immediately. Peter stepped forward, blocking Samuel's path. Samuel, enough. We're all tired of your behavior. Anthony has done nothing wrong, and you have no right to treat him like this. Samuel smirked, his eyes full of disdain. Peter, are you not afraid of me? What do you think you can do? Caroline joined Peter, standing beside him. We're not afraid of you, Samuel. What can you do? Arrest the whole square. Pablo, the younger officer, stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. Samuel, maybe we should reconsider. I don't think this is the best way to handle things. Samuel turned to Pablo, his voice low and sharp. Who are you to tell me what to do? This is my job. The crowd began murmuring louder, many expressing their frustration with Samuel's aggression. Martha clutched Anthony's arm, whispering anxiously, Mr. Anthony, I think we should leave. I don't want you to get hurt. Anthony shook his head, his gaze calm. Martha, if I give up today, I'll have no reason to return tomorrow. Samuel leaned closer to the stall, his voice cold and deliberate. I'll count to 3. If you don't pack up, I'll confiscate everything. Suddenly, Louis stepped out from the crowd, his voice loud and firm. Samuel, if you dare touch this stall, you'll have to deal with all of us. Louis wasn't alone. A group of townspeople slowly moved forward, forming a line around Anthony's stall. They said little, but their determined expressions spoke volumes. They were not afraid of Samuel. Fine. Samuel yelled, his face red with anger. All of you are obstructing law enforcement. I won't let this go. Pablo tugged at Samuel's arm, his tone softer but urgent. Samuel, this isn't the way. We should back off and find another solution. Samuel gritted his teeth and turned to Anthony. This is your final warning, Anthony. If I see you here again, I won't go easy on you. He turned and stormed off, the two officers following behind. The tension in the square began to dissipate, but a heavy weight lingered in everyone's hearts. Anthony looked around, his eyes moist with tears. Thank you, everyone, he said, his voice trembling. I don't know how to express my gratitude. Peter placed a hand on Anthony's shoulder, his voice steady and warm. Anthony, you're not alone. We'll always be here for you. The crowd began to applaud, not just for Anthony but to affirm their unity. Anthony bowed his head, feeling the strength of the support around him. Though tired, he knew this was a memorable day, a day when justice and compassion shone brightly, even if just for a moment. That evening, Martha sat in her small kitchen, her gaze fixed on her phone screen. She had just received a video from Louis, capturing the entire incident in the square that morning. The video showed Samuel threatening Anthony and the crowd's powerful response in standing up for him. Martha bit her lip, her heart heavy with the day's events. But then she took a deep breath and decided to act. She opened her social media app, uploaded the video, and added a caption, an innocent old man just trying to sell pastries to make a living, threatened by an abusive officer. We can't stay silent anymore. Hashtag justice for Antonio, hashtag solidarity. After hitting the post button, Martha felt a weight lift from her shoulders, hoping that Anthony's story would reach more people and inspire them to stand for what's right. The next morning, as Anthony finished setting up his pastry stall, Martha ran over with an excited look on her face. "Mr. Anthony, you have to see this," she said, holding her phone up in front of him. On the screen, a video had been shared thousands of times, accompanied by numerous comments from social media users. "Everyone is on your side, Mr. Anthony," Martha exclaimed, her voice full of enthusiasm. "They're calling you the kind pastry seller of the square. They're demanding justice for you." Anthony looked at the screen, his eyes wide with surprise and emotion. "Martha, I don't know what to say. I never thought people would care about me this much." Peter arrived, carrying a cup of hot coffee. "Anthony, I saw the video too. Everyone in the neighborhood is talking about you. Some people even want to organize a support rally for you right here in the square." "A support rally?" Anthony asked, his voice filled with confusion. "But I'm just a small pastry seller. Why would there need to be a rally for me?" Peter chuckled. "Anthony, you're not just selling pastries. You've become a symbol of kindness and patience. People want to stand up for you for justice." Caroline joined them, carrying a bag of fruit. "Anthony, your stall is going to be busier than ever today. I've heard that people from other neighborhoods are coming to buy pastries to support you." Anthony looked at the friends around him, his heart overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you, everyone. I don't know how I'll ever repay all of your kindness." By noon, the square was more crowded than ever. Passers-by stopped to buy pastries, chat, and take pictures with Anthony. The atmosphere buzzed with positive energy. Martha and Caroline busily helped Anthony sell his pastries, while Peter stood nearby, chatting with customers. Amid the cheerful scene, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the square. A middle-aged man in a suit stepped out, followed by two aides. It was Ramiro, the city's mayor. His arrival immediately captured everyone's attention. "Good morning, Mr. Anthony," Ramiro said, approaching the stall with a friendly smile. "I've heard a lot about your story. The video from this morning was sent to my office." Anthony bowed his head, feeling a bit flustered. "Mr. Mayor, I'm just a small pastry seller. I never thought my story would be worth your attention." Ramiro shook his head. "Anthony, your story isn't just about pastries. It's about patience, injustice, and how a community comes together to protect one of its own. I'm here not only to buy some pastries but to ensure that this situation is thoroughly investigated." Martha stepped forward, her voice filled with passion. "Mr. Mayor, do you know that Samuel has been abusing his power for a long time? He's made life difficult for many people, not just Mr. Anthony." Ramiro nodded. "Thank you, Martha. I've received several reports about Samuel's behavior. I assure you there will be a transparent investigation. But first, I want to apologize to Mr. Anthony for everything he has endured." The crowd erupted into applause, showing their support not just for the mayor's words but for their unity. Anthony felt a wave of relief, though he remained humble. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I only hope that this can all be resolved peacefully." That afternoon, as the crowd began to thin, Anthony sat on a small wooden chair, his eyes following the setting sun. Martha and Caroline sat beside him, while Peter leaned against the pastry stall. "Mr. Anthony, I think today is a day to remember," Martha said, her smile radiant. "Not just because you sold all your pastries, but because you've received the support of an entire community." Anthony nodded, his eyes glistening with emotion. "You're right, Martha. I never thought I would ever feel such kindness and support." Peter placed a hand on Anthony's shoulder. "Anthony, you've done more than sell pastries. You've taught us about patience and compassion. That's what truly matters." Anthony looked around at the people surrounding him, his heart feeling warmer than ever. He knew that while the battle wasn't over, he was no longer alone. And that, to him, was an invaluable gift. The next morning, Anthony woke earlier than usual. He wanted to prepare his pastries perfectly for the day ahead, feeling a newfound sense of purpose after recent events. Outside his window, the sunlight began to break through, heralding a new day filled with hope. When Anthony carried his basket of pastries to the square, he was surprised to find a large group of people already there. Martha, Peter, and Caroline were setting up tables and hanging a small sign that read, "Support Anthony, our kind pastry seller." "What is all this?" Anthony asked, his eyes wide with surprise. "Mr. Anthony, today is your day," Peter replied with a bright smile. "We spoke to people in the neighborhood, and everyone wanted to show their support. This is our way of thanking you for your patience and kindness." Anthony shook his head, feeling touched but also a bit anxious. "Peter, I don't want to cause trouble. I just want to sell my pastries and live peacefully." Caroline stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Anthony's shoulder. "Anthony, this isn't just about you anymore. This is about standing up to injustice. You're not fighting alone." Before long, the square was bustling with activity. Many people from neighboring areas arrived with their families and friends. They came not just to buy pastries but to support Anthony. Young people organized a small performance with music and dancing, turning the square into a lively, positive space. Amid the cheerful atmosphere, a sleek black car pulled into the square. It was Mayor Ramiro, accompanied by 2 aides. His arrival immediately drew the attention of the crowd. Anthony felt nervous, but Peter reassured him. "Don't worry, Anthony. Ramiro promised to help us." Ramiro stepped out of the car, a friendly smile on his face. "Good morning, everyone," he said loudly, his voice echoing across the square. "I'm here today to ensure that justice is served." The crowd applauded, cheering for the mayor's words. Ramiro approached Anthony's stall and bowed slightly in greeting. "Anthony, I've reviewed the entire video and received numerous reports from citizens. On behalf of the city, I want to apologize for what you've been through." Anthony bowed his head, speaking softly. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your concern. But I don't want to make this a big issue. I just want to sell my pastries in peace." Ramiro smiled. "Anthony, your humility is admirable, but I cannot let this matter go unresolved. I have ordered Samuel's suspension and launched an investigation into his abuse of power." Martha stepped forward, her eyes bright. "Mr. Mayor, Samuel hasn't just made life hard for Mr. Anthony. He's been abusing his authority for far too long." Ramiro nodded. "You're right, Martha. This isn't just about Anthony. It's a larger issue. I promise that abusive behavior will not be tolerated." Meanwhile, Caroline and Peter helped arrange more trays of fresh pastries. Anthony tried to stay calm, but inside, he felt a mix of anxiety and gratitude. He never imagined that his story could spread so widely and attract the mayor's attention. As the crowd began to disperse that afternoon, Ramiro sat with Anthony on a wooden bench under a large tree. "Anthony," he said gently, "did you ever think that from your small pastry stall, you would inspire such a powerful movement?" Anthony shook his head, his gaze distant. "Mr. Mayor, I never thought of myself as special. I just wanted to work hard to make it through each day." Ramiro smiled. "That is exactly what makes you special, Anthony. Your kindness and patience have inspired so many. It's something even those in power could learn from." Peter walked over, carrying a cup of hot coffee. "Anthony, I think after today, your pastry stall will no longer just be a place to sell pastries. It will become a symbol of kindness and justice." Anthony chuckled softly, but there was still hesitation in his eyes. "Peter, I'm not sure if I deserve all of this." Caroline, standing nearby, chimed in. "Anthony, you deserve this more than anyone. Not everyone can hold on to their kindness even in the hardest times." That evening, as Anthony returned home, he sat by his window, gazing at the streetlights glowing in the darkness. His heart felt lighter than ever. Despite the challenges ahead, Anthony knew he was not alone. The community had stood up for him, and that gave him newfound strength. 2 days later, Samuel stood at Anthony's door. His face no longer bore the arrogance it once did. Dressed in plain clothes and holding a paper bag in his hands, he looked weary and remorseful. Anthony opened the door, surprised to see Samuel standing there. "Samuel?" Anthony asked, his voice tinged with surprise. "Hello, Mr. Anthony," Samuel said softly. "I'm here to apologize." Anthony looked at him for a moment, as if to confirm he wasn't hearing things. "Apologize? For what?" Samuel sighed deeply, bowing his head. "For everything I've done. I was wrong to treat you the way I did. I let my personal anger cloud my judgment. And now, I realize my actions didn't just hurt you, they hurt me as well." Anthony was silent. He didn't respond immediately but stepped aside, gesturing for Samuel to come in. The small, tidy, yet modest room made Samuel feel slightly uneasy. He placed the paper bag on the table. It contained some baking ingredients and a small bottle of wine. "This is a small token of my apology," Samuel said, his eyes filled with regret. "I know it can't make up for what I've done, but I hope you'll accept my apology." Anthony sat down, his hands resting on the table. He looked at Samuel, his voice gentle but firm. "Samuel, you hurt me deeply. Not just with your actions, but with how you abused your power. But I'm not one to hold grudges. I'll accept your apology, on one condition." Samuel looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "What condition, sir?" "Tomorrow, come to the square and sell pastries with me," Anthony said calmly. "I want you to understand that life isn't easy, especially for people like me. If you truly want to make amends, experience my work." Samuel was taken aback for a moment, but then he nodded. "All right. I'll do it." The next morning, as the sun rose, Anthony was at the square as usual. But this time, Samuel stood beside him, wearing a simple t-shirt and an apron Martha had brought. The crowd quickly noticed Samuel's presence, and murmurs rippled through the square. "Is that Samuel?" someone whispered. "What's he doing here?" Peter walked over, his expression skeptical. "Anthony, what's going on?" Anthony smiled, placing a hand on Peter's shoulder. "Samuel is here to help me today. This is his way of making amends." Peter looked surprised but then nodded. "If that's what you want, Anthony, I'll support it." Samuel began working, helping Anthony arrange pastries and serve customers. At first, he was clumsy and unfamiliar with the tasks. Some customers eyed him warily, but Samuel didn't react. He focused on the work, listening to Anthony's guidance and doing his best. Martha, standing nearby, smiled softly. "The officer is trying," she whispered to Caroline. Caroline smirked but remained cautious. "Let's hope he really has changed." As the morning wore on, Samuel began to feel the difficulty of Anthony's work. Each time a customer came by, he had to smile, listen, and carefully serve the pastries. His hands grew tired, and sweat dotted his forehead. But at the same time, he began to feel a sense of satisfaction when he saw the customers' smiles. By noon, Anthony invited Samuel to sit down and rest. The two of them shared a pastry, and Anthony asked, "Samuel, how do you feel?" Samuel sighed, looking down at his hands. "I never imagined this work would be so hard. I truly respect you, Anthony. You don't just work to make a living, you bring joy to people." Anthony smiled gently. "Samuel, life is never easy. But if we live with sincerity and kindness, things will always get better." That afternoon, Peter, Caroline, and the neighborhood residents organized a small celebration right there in the square to thank Anthony and welcome Samuel's change. The warm atmosphere was filled with laughter and music. Mayor Ramiro also arrived, carrying a large cake with the words, "Thank you, Anthony," written on it. He addressed the crowd, praising Anthony as a symbol of kindness and community. Anthony has taught us that even in the hardest times, patience and compassion can change the world. The crowd applauded, and Anthony felt his heart swell with happiness. As he looked around at Martha, Peter, Caroline, Louis, and even Samuel, he realized he didn't just have friends, he had a large family in this community. As the sun set, Anthony and Samuel stood by the pastry stall, watching the golden lights of the square. Samuel turned to Anthony and said, "Thank you, Anthony. You've taught me a lesson I'll never forget." Anthony smiled and patted Samuel on the shoulder. "Samuel, life is about learning and making amends. You've done the right thing, and that's what matters most." As the twilight faded, the small square grew quiet and peaceful. But in Anthony's heart, a warm light continued to shine, the light of humanity and kindness. This story of Anthony teaches us a profound lesson about kindness, patience, and the power of community. Even in the face of injustice, Anthony held on to his dignity, choosing not to respond with anger or violence. His perseverance and compassion inspired those around him, fostering solidarity in a collective sense of justice. The story also reminds us that change begins with small actions, and acknowledging one's mistakes, as Samuel did, is the first step toward creating a better society.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.